Rome rose in marble, steel, and blood, but its deepest foundations were shaped in silence, within the discreet cores of households, in restrained glances, and in words whispered between veils of linen and silk. For centuries, men etched their names on triumphal columns, gold coins, and political treaties. Yet behind every decree, behind every sword raised, vibrated the invisible influence of Roman women, figures sometimes revered, sometimes feared, but almost always omitted from the official narrative that exalts male power. This story is not about generals or senators, but about the matrons, concubines, priestesses, and empresses who, with subtlety and intelligence, upheld the most powerful empire the world has ever known. The wind that traverses the ruins of the Forum and the baths of Caracalla, that slips through the broken mosaics of the villas in Pompeii, still carries the echoes of these feminine presences. They were much more than decorative figures in the shadow of emperors. They were silent strategists, architects of alliances, hidden warriors in palace intrigues, mothers who shaped future Caesars, and daughters sacrificed in the name of political pacts. The body of the Roman woman was not merely a private space, but a political territory, contested by families, laws, and traditions, where the womb of a matron could seal peace between dynasties or ignite internal wars over the throne. Behind the columns of the Pantheon, behind the veils that hid their faces in processions and sacrifices, Roman women wove, with threads of cunning, a network of influence as solid as the walls of the eternal city. They were not gladiators in the arena, but they dueled in the intricate social battles, where a glance, a gesture, or a strategically planted rumor could determine the fate of a family, or even the empire itself. The marital bed was also a battlefield, marriage a treaty of power, motherhood an extension of state politics. Among the figures that mark this narrative stands the solemn image of Livia Drusilla, not merely as the wife of Augustus, but as the silent architect of the Pax Romana and mother of Emperor Tiberius, perpetuating her lineage through the subtle manipulation of the threads of destiny. In her shadow and under her model, other women walked the halls of the Palatine. Agrippina the elder, whose dignity endured exile, Agrippina the younger, whose ambition placed an emperor on the throne and, ironically, led to her death, and Messalina, whose name still echoes today as a synonym of lust and intrigue, but whose story is far more complex than the caricature tradition has left us. This script thus proposes a long and detailed journey through the lives of these women, who through their choices and renunciations shaped the backbone of the Roman Empire. We will go from the private chambers of the palaces to the public squares where their reputations were judged, from the narratives written by often hostile historians like Tacitus and Suetonius, to the archaeological remnants that reveal more intimate and contradictory aspects of their existences. We will traverse the history of Rome, guided not only by the legions but also by the hearts, fears, hopes, and strategies of these women, who knew, each in her own way, how to bend the invisible currents of power to their favor. And thus, as we advance in this narrative, we will understand that Rome, in its glory and its decadence, cannot be fully comprehended without the presence of the women who inhabited it, challenged it, and often transformed it from within. The greatness of Rome does not rest solely in its marble and monuments, but also in the untold stories that now, at last, emerge from the millennial shadows. This is the story of these women, and in hearing it, perhaps we also hear the eternal whisper of all those who, throughout history, have shaped the world while the world refused to recognize them. In the social architecture of ancient Rome, women seemed confined to the boundaries of the home, in the shadow of the columns of the domus, between the atrium and the peristyle, while men dominated the forum, the assemblies, and the battlefields. But this appearance concealed an intricate system where women played crucial, often invisible roles that defined the moral, economic, and political fabric of Roman society. The image of the matron, respectable, honorable, and silent, was the ideal propagated in official discourse, reinforced by laws and customs. Yet practice revealed a more ambiguous and complex reality. From birth, the trajectory of a Roman woman was rigidly traced by her genes, the family lineage that determined her social position and obligations. Girls were educated to serve the interests of the family, but this education went beyond domestic docility. While they learned the crafts of weaving and household management, they were also instructed in the subtleties of marital alliances and the maintenance of family status. Many could read and write, especially in patrician families, and were familiar with the fundamentals of law, rhetoric, and even philosophy, as they needed to be able to advise their husbands or mediate family conflicts. Marriage in both Republican and Imperial Rome was not an act of love, but a political and economic contract. The woman became a fundamental instrument in the web of alliances that sustained the Roman aristocracy. Her body was a currency. The dowry, money, property, or movable goods, guaranteed the solidity of the marital pact, while her fertility ensured the continuity of the lineage. The absence of children, especially male heirs, could be interpreted as a grave failure, capable of compromising the family's prestige and sometimes leading to the dissolution of the marriage. Despite this apparent objectification, the Roman woman was not entirely devoid of agency. Matrons exercised decisive influence over family affairs, especially when their husbands were absent, participating in military campaigns or political missions in the provinces. During such periods, it was the women who managed rural estates, negotiated with tenants, and oversaw the education of their children. Thus, the figure of the matron transcended the limits of domestic space and entered, albeit indirectly, the public sphere. Roman laws, though conceived to limit female autonomy, paradoxically opened loopholes that allowed some women to accumulate considerable power. The manors which bound a woman to her husband's authority was gradually replaced by the guardianship of her father or relatives, allowing many widows or orphans to directly control their assets. During the empire, with the multiplication of sine manu marriages, it became increasingly common for women to retain possession of their wealth, granting them greater economic independence. On the other hand, moral and legal norms regarding female behavior were severe. Chastity and fidelity were non-negotiable imperatives for the married woman, not only as private values, but as foundations of public order and social stability. Laws such as the Lex Julia de Adulteris Coercendis, promulgated by Augustus, criminalized female adultery, turning it into a matter of state. An adulterous woman could be repudiated, stripped of her property, and even exiled. Roman morality did not tolerate deviations from the norm, especially because it viewed the female womb as the guardian of the purity of aristocratic lineages. By contrast, male adultery was widely tolerated, seen as a natural expression of Roman virility. This legal and social asymmetry highlights the paradoxical position of women, venerated as symbols of family virtue, yet monitored and controlled as potential threats to social order. And yet many knew how to transform these limitations into strategies of power. Through female social networks, religious festivals, patronage, and even artistic sponsorship, Roman women expanded their presence in public life, building reputations and accumulating influence. The home for the Roman woman was not just a prison, but also a fortress. There, alliances were forged, strategic friendships cultivated, and future emperors shaped. The forum might have been closed to their voices, but their decisions reverberated there, shaping laws, influencing magistrates, and even swaying the Senate in favor of their family. Thus, between the home and the forum, the Roman woman moved as an ambiguous figure, at once confined and indispensable, silent and powerful, traditional and transgressive. This structural tension between what was permitted and what was accomplished is one of the keys to understanding Rome's social dynamics and the fundamental role of women in its sustenance and transformation. And it is from this perspective that we continue our journey, now entering the space where female power became even more palpable, the Roman domus, that intimate stage where women masterfully performed the most complex acts of imperial politics. The Roman domus, more than a mere residence, was a microcosm of society, a miniature replica of the power relations that upheld the grandeur of the empire. There, among marble columns, colorful mosaics, and pergolas perfumed by vines and laurels, Roman women found their primary sphere of action. The domus was not just a shelter, but also a stage for political performances, family alliances, and social negotiations. At the center of this stage stood the matron, the lady of the house, whose role far exceeded the limits of domesticity to become a silent yet indispensable protagonist in the maintenance and expansion of familial power. The entrance of the domus, the vestibulum, was not merely a space of physical transition, but also a symbolic one. There, the matron received visitors, managed daily affairs, and organized family rituals. The woman's position in this space was defined by a balance. Though protected by the decorum required of elite Roman women, she also had to display the family's opulence, hospitality, and honor. Every meal served, every fabric chosen for the triclinium, every scent diffused in the baths was not mere aesthetic whim, but a carefully orchestrated political statement by the matron, reinforcing her gene's reputation. Inside the home, the woman exercised authority over enslaved persons, coordinated domestic services, and supervised the education of sons and daughters, especially in their formative years. Maternal pedagogy was decisive, for from the hands of these women emerged future magistrates, generals, and often emperors. Thus, more than transmitters of moral values, matrons were character shapers, invisible sculptors of the personalities that would one day decide Rome's fate. The famous title Domina, by which enslaved people addressed their mistresses, encapsulated this discreet yet undeniable authority. Beyond their formative role, the domus was also a space of economic management. Many matrons administered vast estates, coordinated agricultural enterprises, and even urban businesses, especially in the absence of husbands, often engaged in distant military campaigns or diplomatic missions. The Roman woman knew how to negotiate with tenants, hire free and enslaved labor, and ensure the supply of markets. This economic competence, though not formally recognized in public institutions, secured women a position of power that often rivaled that of their own husbands. But the domus was not limited to production and reproduction. It was also the privileged stage for female religious life. The matron conducted the household cults dedicated to the Lares and Penates, the protective deities of family and home. Daily rituals, offerings to ancestors, and annual festivities organized in the private space conferred upon the woman a priestly role within the family, reinforcing her spiritual and cultural centrality. This religious dimension of female power was carefully observed by Roman society, which saw in the maintenance of the domestic cult a guarantee of the city's stability itself. Moreover, the domus was often a center of female social networks. Women visited and received other matrons, participated in literary gatherings, embroidery sessions, or religious ceremonies where alliances were forged, political information exchanged, and marriages negotiated. In this circuit, women practiced a parallel diplomacy based on emotional bonds, family interests, and marital strategies. Thus, the matron was not just the guardian of the house keys, but also the master key that opened doors to new political and economic opportunities. Finally, the domus was also a space of resistance and transgression. Not all women resigned themselves to the role of discreet administrators. Some, like Messalina or Agrippina the Younger, transformed the private space into a base of operations for decisive interventions in imperial politics. The bed, the triclinium, the garden, all these domestic spaces could become arenas of contest, where feminine cunning subverted the limitations imposed by law and custom. Thus, the Roman domus reveals itself through the lens of women's history as a true arena of power, as significant as the Senate or the Campus Martius. Within it, Roman women wove the invisible threads that sustained the politics, economy, religion, and culture of their society. And it was upon this foundation, simultaneously domestic and political, that some of the greatest female figures in Roman history were raised. Let us now advance to the space where these hidden influences became most evident: the palace intrigues, the conspiracies, and the games of power that women masterfully conducted, often deciding from the shadows the very fate of the empire. Within the gilded walls of the Palatine, where cold marble upheld columns raised for eternity, true power was often exercised in the shadows, in low voices, behind the heavy curtains that separated public halls from private chambers. If the Roman Senate represented the official stage where laws and treaties were proclaimed, it was within the silent corridors of the palaces that the most vital decisions were woven, often influenced, determined, or even imposed by the will and cunning of Roman women. This hidden power, almost always omitted from official accounts, shaped the course of imperial history with the same force as Rome's disciplined legions. The politics of matrons and empresses were not conducted with gladius or togas, but with alliances forged at private dinners, secrets whispered in the ears of husbands, sons, or lovers, and pacts sealed by veiled promises. The influence of women at the heart of Rome was not merely anecdotal or exceptional. It was a structural element of the very machinery of imperial politics. The prevailing idea that power belonged exclusively to men is a myth nourished by official chroniclers, but the records that survived time, letters, coins, portraits, and contemporary analyses reveal a silent, sophisticated, and decisive network of power. The palace intrigues that characterized the imperial period were to a large extent articulated or driven by women. Livia Drusilla, wife of Augustus, is perhaps the most paradigmatic example. While the emperor consolidated the Pax Romana, Livia wove a network of influences that ensured her son Tiberius's rise, discreetly eliminating rivals to the throne. The accusations of poisoning and manipulation attributed to her, though possibly exaggerated by detractors, reveal how the perception of female power was often tinged with distrust, fear, and misogyny. Poison, seduction, and slander were weapons associated with the female arsenal, not by nature but by necessity, since the traditional paths to power, magistracy, the army, the Senate, were closed to women. Thus, they mastered the domain of personal relationships, emotions, and human vulnerabilities, where many empresses and matrons demonstrated incomparable skill. Roman historians such as Tacitus and Suetonius painted cruel portraits of these women, depicting them as lascivious, manipulative, or murderous figures, a clear attempt to undermine their political importance and reinforce the patriarchal values of Roman society. But the structure of imperial power cannot be fully understood without recognizing this female protagonism. Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero, is another emblematic example. Her direct intervention in the imperial succession and the administration of government, at least during the early years of her son's reign, show a woman not only ambitious but deeply aware of Roman political mechanisms. Her death, orchestrated by Nero, is not merely a tragic episode, but the brutal testimony to the risks undertaken by women who dared to transgress the invisible boundaries of permitted power. Beyond empresses, wives, and mothers of emperors, influential Roman women acted as informal advisors, intermediaries in delicate negotiations, and even political agents. A senator's wife could, through her family and social contacts, influence the election of magistrates, support candidates, or destabilize opponents. Marriage, in this context, was not merely a private pact, but a tool of political engineering where the woman was simultaneously the object and the agent of power. Palaces, with their secret gardens and chambers adorned with sensual frescoes, were laboratories of power. Every banquet, every feast, every meeting between matrons and senators was potentially an arena of conspiracy. The informality of these spaces allowed women to exert an influence that, although not codified by formal institutions, was decisive for the functioning of the political system. The phrase "behind every great man there is a great woman" finds in imperial Rome a concrete and often literal manifestation. Conversely, the fear that men harbored of this hidden power also fueled the stereotype of woman as a source of corruption, disorder, and decadence. The moralist literature of the period is filled with warnings against the influence of wives and mothers, reflecting the dread that the male elite nurtured at the prospect of losing the monopoly of power. And ironically, that same literature provides us with precious clues to the extent and effectiveness of female power at the heart of Rome. This hidden power, constructed at the confluence of affections, family duties, and political strategies, was as decisive as the battles fought on the empire's frontiers. In fact, it was often these palace intrigues that determined who would wield the sword in Rome's name, or who, on the contrary, would fall before it. And it is among these games of power that figures such as Livia, Agrippina, Messalina, and so many others stand out, whose stories we will now explore, not as caricatures of villains or martyrs, but as complex protagonists of a history that finally demands to be told. Let us now prepare to delve into the trajectory of one of the most renowned and influential of them all, Livia Drusilla, the empress who, more than any general, architected the birth and perpetuation of the Roman Empire. When Rome transformed from an unstable, convulsed republic into a stable and enduring imperial power, many credited this feat to the political genius of Caesar Augustus, the first emperor. Yet behind the serene figure of the princeps operated the astute and calculating mind of a woman who, silently and with imperturbable elegance, shaped the destiny not only of her family, but of the entire empire. Livia Drusilla. The trajectory of this matron, marked by diplomatic subtleties and an impressive strategic capacity, transformed her into the true architect of Roman imperial power. Born in 58 before Christ into the influential Claudian genes, Livia Drusilla Claudia was from childhood instructed in the rigid aristocratic discipline that molded elite Roman women. She married young to Tiberius Claudius Nero, with whom she had 2 sons, Tiberius, who would one day become emperor, and Drusus, the future commander of the Germanic legions. However, her life changed forever when, during the turbulence of the civil wars, she crossed paths with Gaius Octavius, Julius Caesar's heir, then in meteoric ascendancy. Enchanted by her beauty and impressed by her noble lineage, Octavian, later Augustus, did not hesitate to take the young married woman as his own, in a move that today might seem scandalous, but which in that context was a powerful political maneuver. Livia and Augustus officially united in 38 before Christ, sealing one of the most enduring and effective political and marital partnerships in Roman history. Though they had no children together, Livia cared as a mother for Augustus's heirs, while carefully ensuring the promotion of her own sons, especially Tiberius, within the succession line. At her husband's side, she played a central role in constructing the public image of the new regime, helping to forge the narrative of moral and political renewal of Rome after decades of civil war. Her irreproachable conduct as wife, matron, and counselor consolidated the ideal of the virtuous and devoted Roman woman, while simultaneously being a powerful political machine operating behind the scenes. Livia masterfully balanced the discretion expected of a matron with the influence conferred by her role as the wife of the princeps. She acted as an informal advisor to Augustus, participating actively in state decisions, whether counseling on matters of succession, promoting advantageous family alliances, or mediating political conflicts among senatorial factions. Her home became a true center of political articulation, where the fate of entire families was decided in seemingly trivial conversations, at banquets, or during carefully organized religious ceremonies. Livia's legendary, and for some infamous ability to eliminate rivals and consolidate her family's position in the imperial succession is well known. Ancient historians such as Tacitus accused her of being directly or indirectly responsible for the deaths of several potential heirs of Augustus, including Gaius and Lucius Caesar, sons of Julia, Augustus's daughter. Although such accusations are the subject of debate among modern historians, it is undeniable that after the tumultuous succession, the throne ultimately fell to Tiberius, Livia's son, thus ensuring the continuity of the dynasty and strengthening the Julio-Claudian clan. But reducing Livia to the caricature of a Machiavellian stepmother would be a gross mistake. She was also a great promoter of public works, a patron of artists, and a devotee of religious causes. Her involvement in the moralization of Roman society, through support for Augustus's laws on marriage and childbirth, was decisive in legitimizing the new regime. Her image, minted on coins, engraved in public statuary, and celebrated in monuments such as the Arapassis, perpetuated the ideal model of the Empress, mother of the fatherland, an example of virtue, balance, and dedication to the common good. After Augustus's death in 14 after Christ, Livia officially assumed the title of Augusta, further consolidating her position as the tutelary figure of the empire. However, her relationship with her son Tiberius, now emperor, progressively deteriorated, marked by resentments and silent disputes for control of the court. According to some sources, Tiberius distanced himself from his mother in the final years of her life, retreating to the island of Capri and leaving Rome under the sway of courtiers and advisors. Livia died in 29 after Christ, at the age of 86, and was posthumously deified by her grandson Emperor Claudius, who erected a temple in her honor. The legacy of Livia Drusilla is immense and ambivalent, a model of the virtuous matron, a symbol of imperial stability, but also a paradigm of the woman who skillfully and coldly maneuvered the machinery of absolute power. Her name echoes to this day as one of the greatest examples of how, even in a society that formally excluded women from political power, intelligence, patience, and strategy could transform them into determining figures for the destiny of an entire civilization. And so, after unveiling the journey of this woman who shaped the foundations of the empire, we now proceed to an equally remarkable story, but with tragic and rebellious contours. The trajectory of Julia, the daughter of Augustus, whose fate shocked Rome and revealed the limits imposed on women who dared to challenge the ideal of virtue projected by power. At the heart of a regime that claimed to be the guardian of Roman morality, there arose a figure who at once embodied and defied the values of the new empire, Julia, the only daughter of Caesar Augustus. Her trajectory, marked by unparalleled privileges, but also by an exemplary condemnation, exposes the contradictions of a society that, while preaching virtue, maintained control over women as a fundamental pillar of its political and social order. Julia was a woman who dared to live beyond the expectations imposed upon matrons, and for that, she paid an immense price, the loss of freedom, honor, and the right to her own story. Born in 39 before Christ, the product of the marriage between Augustus and Scribonia, Julia was, from childhood, an object of carefully crafted political strategies orchestrated by her father. Upon breaking with Scribonia to marry Livia Drusilla, Augustus kept his daughter as a central piece in his dynastic policy. Educated with the utmost rigor, Julia learned literature, philosophy, etiquette, and above all the role that destiny had reserved for her, to be an instrument of marital alliances that would guarantee the stability and continuity of the regime. Thus, her emotional life never truly belonged to her, but was entirely directed by the interests of the state. While still a teenager, Julia was promised to Marcellus, Augustus's nephew and designated heir, in a union that symbolized the reconciliation of Rome's principal aristocratic factions. However, Marcellus's premature death in 23 before Christ forced Augustus to redesign his succession plans. Julia was then successively married to two of the most powerful men in Rome, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, general and close friend of Augustus, and, after his death, to Tiberius, Livia's son. Each marriage aimed to consolidate alliances and secure heirs who would perpetuate Julio-Claudian domination. From her marriage to Agrippa, Julia bore 5 children, among them Gaius and Lucius Caesar, both adopted by Augustus and groomed as successors. As the mother of future emperors, Julia appeared to fulfill the role that Roman society expected of her, to be the fertile and virtuous womb ensuring the continuity of power. Yet behind this carefully constructed public image existed a woman who sought, perhaps desperately, spaces for personal and emotional autonomy within the rigid familial and political structures that imprisoned her. Julia, unlike her stepmother Livia, did not choose the path of dissimulation or silent influence. Her life, as recounted by chroniclers such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, was marked by an open pursuit of pleasure and freedom. She participated in literary and philosophical gatherings, mingled with artists and intellectuals, hosted banquets and, according to ancient sources, engaged in numerous extramarital affairs. These behaviors, which might have been considered commonplace among elite Roman men, assumed scandalous dimensions when practiced by a woman, especially by the emperor's daughter and the ultimate symbol of the regime's moral reforms. The paradox is evident. Augustus had promulgated severe laws to curb what he deemed dissolute customs, such as the Lex Julia de Adulteris Coercendis, criminalizing adultery and aiming to restore traditional Roman family values. And his own daughter, ironically, became the public embodiment of what he most fought against. The situation became untenable, not only due to the risk to the dynasty's reputation, but also because Julia represented a threat to the empire's political stability, as her lovers included aristocrats capable of conspiring for succession. In Succus before Christ, after a secret internal proceeding and an exemplary condemnation, Julia was accused of adultery and exiled to the island of Pandateria, an arid and isolated rock in the Tyrrhenian Sea. There she remained under strict surveillance, deprived of any comfort or contact with her children, who were taken from her as an additional punishment. Julia's exile was not merely a personal sanction, but a political spectacle designed to reaffirm Augustus's commitment to the moral reforms underpinning his regime. The daughter became a tragic symbol of the rigidity of the very laws her father had created. Julia's trajectory reveals the contradictions and limits imposed upon Roman women. Even as a member of the highest lineage and holding a central role in perpetuating imperial power, she was ultimately a victim of the very order she helped to construct. Her attempt to escape her condition as a cog in the political machine met the relentless repression of a system that viewed female freedom as a threat to public order. She died in 14 after Christ, the same year Augustus passed away, never having been officially forgiven or rehabilitated. Julia's case brutally illustrates that a Roman woman could be exalted as the ideal mother and wife, but never allowed to live as an autonomous individual. Her freedom was in practice a risk to be contained, her sexuality a public asset to be monitored, her life an instrument of state policy. And thus, while the men of her family perpetuated themselves as gods in the imperial pantheon, Julia was relegated to oblivion, a name erased from monuments, a story that would only resurface centuries later as a poignant example of the price women paid for defying the conventions of their time. And so, after crossing the shadows of Julia's life, we prepare to encounter another Roman woman whose trajectory was likewise marked by courage, pain, and resistance. Agrippina the Elder, the mother who dared to challenge the Caesars, facing exile and persecution in defense of her honor and her family. Amid the splendor and decay of the Roman Empire, few female figures stood out with the intensity and dignity of Agrippina the Elder, direct descendant of Augustus and devoted wife of Germanicus, the general beloved by both the legions and the people. Her life, marked by unwavering loyalty to her family and indomitable resistance in the face of political persecution, personifies the model of the Roman matron elevated to its purest expression. The mother who, even in the face of mourning and exile, never renounced her honor nor the defense of her own. Agrippina the Elder was born around 14 before Christ, daughter of Julia, who had been banished by Augustus, and Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, the loyal general of the first emperor. Thus, by blood, she bore the weight of one of Rome's most powerful and closely watched lineages, destined to be both an emblem of dynastic continuity and a potential source of instability for imperial power. Her education was refined. She mastered literature, Stoic philosophy, and rhetoric, skills she would later wield with precision in tribunes and political confrontations. She married Germanicus Julius Caesar, nephew and adopted son of Emperor Tiberius, in a union that sealed the alliance of the empire's principal houses. Germanicus, charismatic and virtuous, represented the hope of renewal for the Roman people, in contrast to the austere and unpopular figure of Tiberius. Agrippina, as wife, accompanied him on all military campaigns, sharing the privations, displacements, and risks of the battlefield, something rare and remarkable for a Roman woman of her stature. Thus, she became admired not only for her lineage, but also for the courage and fidelity with which she supported her husband and children. The couple had 9 children, 6 of whom survived, including Caligula, the future emperor, and Agrippina the Younger, who would also profoundly mark Rome's history. Agrippina's public image as a prolific and devoted mother became ingrained in Roman memory, especially since her motherhood was seen not merely as a personal trait, but as an essential political function for dynastic continuity. Yet her life would suffer an irreparable blow with the premature death of Germanicus in 19 after Christ, during a mission in the East, under circumstances shrouded in suspicions of poisoning, possibly instigated by Tiberius himself or his allies. The pain of loss did not silence Agrippina. On the contrary, her figure transformed into a symbol of resistance and indignation. She demanded justice, publicly accusing Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, governor of Syria, of having assassinated her husband at the behest of hidden forces within the empire. The return of Germanicus's body to Rome was one of the most dramatic funeral processions in imperial history. Agrippina, dressed in mourning, carrying her husband's ashes, traversed the streets of the city under the emotional gaze of the populace and the legions, who saw in her not only the inconsolable widow, but also the embodiment of Roman virtue and resistance to tyranny. This gesture, both courageous and politically risky, put Agrippina on a direct collision course with Emperor Tiberius and his powerful advisor, Sejanus, head of the Praetorian Guard. Her growing popularity posed a real threat to the regime's stability. Agrippina, however, refused to remain silent. She openly defended her son's rights to succession, denounced the injustices of the court and opposed the repression imposed by Tiberius and Sejanus upon her family. Her firm and fearless stance defied the traditional boundaries imposed on Roman women, who were expected to remain confined to private space and submission. In response, Tiberius's regime launched a systematic campaign to destroy Agrippina and her descendants. Accusations of improper behavior, conspiracies, and treason were leveled against her and her sons. The mother, once a symbol of virtue and a model matron, was now portrayed by political enemies as an arrogant woman, ambitious and defiant of the established order. The persecution culminated in her exile to the island of Pandateria, the same place where her own mother, Julia, had been banished decades earlier. The cycle of punishment for women of the dynasty repeated itself, relentless. On the island, Agrippina endured extreme physical and psychological privations, deprived of contact with her children and any political support. Yet she refused to admit guilt or to beg for clemency. In 33 after Christ, after years of suffering, she died of starvation according to some sources, the result of deliberate mistreatment or perhaps a hunger strike she undertook in protest against her condition. Her death, silent and far from the eyes of Rome, contrasted with the resounding strength of her public life. Agrippina the Elder, however, was not forgotten. Her memory lived on, not only through her children, especially Caligula, who ascended to the imperial throne, but also as the example of a woman who dared to confront absolute power, who fought for her family's honor and future, and who did not retreat even when faced with ostracism and death. Her life illustrates with raw clarity the limits imposed on Roman women, but also their capacity for resistance, agency, and protagonism. And thus, as we conclude the narrative of Agrippina the Elder, we turn our gaze to a figure who, sharing the same name and an equally tragic destiny, would take audacity and the pursuit of power to an unprecedented level: Agrippina the Younger, the woman who placed an emperor on the throne, only to be ultimately victimized by the very son she elevated to power. Few figures in the history of Rome embodied the ambivalence of female power with such intensity as Agrippina the Younger. Daughter of Agrippina the Elder and General Germanicus, granddaughter of Marcus Agrippa, and great-granddaughter of Augustus, her lineage placed her from birth at the epicenter of imperial disputes. But her trajectory was not marked solely by blood inheritance. She transformed herself by her own merit into one of the most influential, feared, and controversial women of the Roman Empire. Her name passed into posterity not only as the mother of Nero, the most infamous emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, but as the architect of one of the most audacious political operations of antiquity. Born in 15 after Christ, in a moment of great political tension, Agrippina lost her father while still a child and saw her mother exiled and executed by order of Tiberius, an experience that profoundly shaped her views on power, loyalty, and survival. Raised amid palace intrigues, she learned from an early age that for a woman of her stature, every gesture was a strategic move and every silence an assertion of strength. Her youth was marked by remarkable beauty and sharp intelligence, attributes she skillfully mobilized within Rome's complex political webs. She first married Domitius Ahenobarbus, with whom she had her only son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, later known as Nero. The relationship was brief and marked by violence, but the birth of her son secured the continuity of her lineage and a new political card to be played in the future. After her husband's death, she faced a period of ostracism, aggravated by the constant suspicions of conspiracy that hovered over Germanicus's descendants. Yet her resilience and her acute understanding of palace dynamics enabled her spectacular ascent in the following decade. The turning point in Agrippina's life came when, with remarkable audacity, she orchestrated her return to the center of power by marrying her uncle, Emperor Claudius, in 49 after Christ. The union, which provoked scandal among the more conservative sectors of Roman society, was legalized through the approval of a special law permitting marriages between uncles and nieces, demonstrating how legal norms could be molded by political interests. As Empress consort, Agrippina did not settle for a decorative role. She effectively occupied the government, influencing her husband's decisions, promoting allies, and eliminating adversaries. One of her boldest and most decisive moves was to secure the adoption of her son Nero by Claudius, placing him ahead of the natural heir, Britannicus. From that moment, she meticulously prepared her son's ascent to the throne, consolidating alliances among senators and the Praetorian Guard, while undermining the position of rivals. In 54 after Christ, Claudius died suddenly under circumstances many attributed to poisoning ordered by Agrippina, though her responsibility was never formally proven. With her husband's death, the empress found herself at the helm of the empire as mother and regent of a teenager, whom many regarded as unfit to govern alone. During the early years of Nero's reign, Agrippina exercised near absolute power. She actively participated in imperial council meetings, influenced the appointment of governors, and commanded public ceremonies alongside her son. Her image was widely disseminated on coins and statues, a clear demonstration of the new centrality of female power in the empire. Yet this maternal supremacy quickly turned into a source of tension. As Nero matured, he sought to assert his autonomy, resenting the dominant presence and control his mother exercised over his political and personal life. The conflict between mother and son became inevitable. Agrippina opposed the young emperor's excesses, openly criticized his love affairs, and interfered in his administrative decisions. The dispute culminated in a series of progressive exclusions. First, Agrippina was barred from state meetings. Then, she was removed from the imperial palace, and finally she became the target of a deadly conspiracy. In 59 after Christ, Nero ordered the execution of his own mother, in one of the most dramatic and emblematic scenes of imperial history. Ancient sources report that the initial attempt to kill her by sinking a boat failed, forcing Nero to send soldiers to complete the assassination. Before dying, Agrippina is said to have uttered the famous phrase, "Strike my womb," indicating the place where Nero had been conceived, a final tragic affirmation of her maternity. The death of Agrippina the Younger sealed the fate of one of the most formidable women in Rome's history. Her trajectory, from a childhood marked by persecution to the glory of Empress Mother and then to a brutal execution, clearly reveals the possibilities and risks of female power within Rome's patriarchal structure. Agrippina was not a passive victim of circumstance. She was an active agent, a strategist of rare competence who knew how to manipulate the imperial game's rules to her advantage, until she was ultimately consumed by the same logic of violence and suspicion she had so often employed. Her legacy endures as a symbol of the ability of Roman women to intervene decisively in politics, even from the margins of formal power institutions. And in contemplating her figure, we understand that in Rome, power was not wielded only by Caesars, senators, and generals, but also and frequently by women who, between the sheets and the halls of the Palatine, wrote, with blood and cunning, the most dramatic pages of imperial history. And so, after the brilliant and tragic life of Agrippina the Younger, we turn our gaze to another figure, whose story is intertwined with the very definition of power and female depravity in Rome, Messalina, the empress whose lust and conspiracies scandalized the empire and sealed her fate with death and infamy. If Agrippina the Younger symbolized the Roman woman, who through political cunning shaped the imperial destiny with discreet but firm hands, Messalina, in turn, was immortalized as the icon of debauchery and conspiracy, a figure whose memory traversed the centuries tinged with scandal, mystery, and exaggeration. Wife of Emperor Claudius, empress consort during one of the most critical moments of the Roman Empire, Valeria Messalina was, for the chroniclers of Antiquity, an explosive combination of beauty, boundless ambition, and unbridled lust, although reality, as so often, was far more complex than the caricature crafted by her enemies. Born around 20 after Christ, Messalina descended from one of Rome's noblest families, the gens Valeria, and like Agrippina the Younger, was a great-granddaughter of Augustus. Her position at court was secured not only by blood, but also by the political astuteness of her family, who successfully positioned her as the ideal wife for Claudius, a man initially seen as harmless and politically irrelevant until fate led him to the imperial purple after Caligula's assassination in 41 after Christ. Her marriage to Claudius, sealed even before his rise to the throne, granted Messalina not only the title of Augusta, but also an effective power that she wielded intensely. As empress, Messalina occupied a central space in administration and palace intrigues. She bore 2 children with Claudius, Germanicus and Octavia, thus sealing her influence over the dynasty's future. But rapidly, her public figure became associated, in the accounts of historians such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Juvenal, with a woman driven by insatiable desires, involved in an endless succession of extramarital affairs, conspiracies, and betrayals. According to these sources, Messalina not only betrayed the emperor, but also organized orgies in the palace, and even competed with prostitutes in Rome's brothels to prove her sexual supremacy, images that fueled one of the most infamous legends in Roman history. Behind these moralizing narratives, however, lies the reality of a woman deeply engaged in the struggles for imperial power. Messalina efficiently eliminated several political rivals, both among senators and within the imperial family, always seeking to secure her position and that of her children in the line of succession. Her influence over Claudius was well known. She appointed allies to important offices, interfered in administrative decisions, and promoted those who served her interests. The most famous and fatal episode of her life occurred in 48 after Christ, when, according to sources, Messalina secretly married Gaius Silius, a young patrician of striking beauty and influence. The ceremony, allegedly conducted while she was still married to Claudius, was interpreted as an attempted coup d'état, a maneuver to eliminate Claudius and place Silius on the throne, ensuring Messalina's continued position and direct control of power. The audacity of this act surpassed any precedent in imperial history, and by Roman moral and political standards was utterly unacceptable. Claudius, until then seemingly unaware of his wife's machinations, was alerted by his advisors, particularly the powerful freedman Narcissus, who orchestrated a swift and ruthless response. Silius was arrested and executed, and Messalina, betrayed by her own allies and abandoned by those who once courted her, was sentenced to death by her husband without the right to defense or a public trial. Found in a garden near the city, desperate and stripped of the haughtiness that had so often defined her, Messalina reportedly hesitated to take her own life, forcing the imperial executioner to fulfill the sentence. Her death, shrouded in rumors, marked the end of a meteoric trajectory, but left a complex and controversial legacy. For the chroniclers of the time and the moralists who followed, Messalina became the personification of a woman corrupted by excesses of power and pleasure, an example to be execrated, a warning to future empresses about the limits of female ambition. However, modern historiographical analyses recognize that her image was extensively constructed and distorted by political adversaries, a common strategy to turn powerful women into monstrous figures, thus justifying their elimination and consolidating new political orders. Thus, Messalina was not merely the lascivious empress of Roman legends, but also a woman deeply embedded in the brutal game of imperial politics, where risk and reward were inseparable, and where life, especially for a woman with power, could be tragically brief. Her story reveals both the limits and the dangers of female power in imperial Rome, as well as the fascination and terror these figures evoked among their contemporaries. And now, leaving behind Messalina's vertiginous trajectory, we move forward to another woman who, with beauty and cunning, reached the pinnacle of imperial power, but whose fate would be equally tragic. Poppaea Sabina, the empress who conquered Nero, rivaled Octavia, and paid with her life the price of her ambition and her position. In the long gallery of female figures who shaped the destinies of the Roman Empire, few were as striking for their combination of beauty, intelligence, and ambition as Poppaea Sabina. Her trajectory, which crossed the most sumptuous halls and the darkest backrooms of power, personifies the archetype of the woman who, endowed with rare magnetism, ascends to the highest heights, only to be tragically destroyed by the very system that propelled her. Poppaea Sabina was the wife of Emperor Nero, and her life and death reflect the complexities of female power in first-century Rome, where imperial love was as volatile as it was dangerous. Poppaea was born around 30 after Christ into a prestigious family, though not directly linked to the imperial house. Her father, Titus Ollius, was a career military officer, and her mother, Poppaea Sabina the Elder, was celebrated for her beauty, a legacy that Poppaea not only inherited, but skillfully transformed into one of her main weapons to ascend the rigid social hierarchy of Rome. From a young age, she stood out for her elegance, intelligence, and ability to cultivate strategic relationships, qualities that quickly brought her to the center of attention among the Roman elite. Before reaching the pinnacle of power, Poppaea married twice, first to Rufrius Crispinus, with whom she had a son, and then to Otho, one of Nero's closest friends, who would later also become emperor. Yet her relationship with Otho was, in truth, the springboard to her greatest conquest, the heart and throne beside Nero. According to ancient accounts, Poppaea and Nero began an affair while she was still married to Otho, provoking equal measures of scandal and admiration. Aware of her influence over the young emperor, Poppaea did not hesitate to maneuver to eliminate the obstacles to her ascent. Foremost among these obstacles was Octavia, Nero's legitimate wife and daughter of Emperor Claudius, whose position as empress represented a symbol of continuity for the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Poppaea expertly exploited the existing tensions between Nero and Octavia, presenting herself as the woman who could fulfill the emperor's desires and ambitions. Her unparalleled beauty and her keen ability to understand Nero's emotional and political needs made her not only his lover, but also his closest counselor. In 62 after Christ, after years of tension and scheming, Nero divorced Octavia, who was accused of sterility and adultery, exiled and subsequently executed. The path was clear for Poppaea, who was quickly elevated to the status of Augusta, becoming empress consort. Yet her position was as fragile as it was elevated. It depended entirely on Nero's favor, a man of unstable temperament, prone to acts of violence and irrationality. Poppaea, however, seemed unfazed by this risk. On the contrary, she knew how to maintain her place beside the emperor, influencing his decisions and consolidating a public image of harmony and imperial beauty. As empress, Poppaea was portrayed in coins and sculptures with unprecedented refinement, reinforcing her image as the embodiment of Roman beauty. Her passion for jewelry, perfumes, and luxurious clothing became legendary, as did her inclination for Eastern religious practices, particularly the cult of Isis, which was beginning to gain favor among Rome's elites. These choices reflected not only personal tastes, but also a conscious strategy to distinguish herself from traditional Roman women and to associate with an ideal of exotic and seductive female power. However, Poppaea's fate would be, like that of so many other women close to the throne, sealed by violence. In 65 after Christ, pregnant with her second child by Nero, Poppaea died abruptly and brutally. Ancient sources diverge on the exact circumstances of her death, but the most famous version, reported by Suetonius and Tacitus, claims that in a fit of rage, Nero kicked her in the abdomen, causing fatal injuries. This account, profoundly symbolic, cruelly illustrates the precariousness of the female position at the heart of imperial power. Even the most beautiful and influential woman, even the mother of the empire's heir, could be annihilated in an instant, a victim of male caprice and brutality. Poppaea's death reportedly left Nero devastated, to the point of ordering sumptuous funerals and deifying her posthumously, erecting a magnificent tomb and promoting cults in her honor. Others suggest that his grief was less about love and more about guilt and remorse. Either way, Poppaea Sabina entered history not only as one of Rome's most beautiful and influential empresses, but also as a symbol of the extreme fragility of women who dared to ascend to the pinnacle of imperial power. Her trajectory highlights once again the ruthless logic that governed the Roman palace. Beauty, charm, and intelligence could open the most inaccessible doors, but remaining there depended on the ability to survive an environment where alliances were fleeting, where imperial love could turn to mortal hatred, and where the price of female ambition was often life itself. And thus, after the fascinating and tragic trajectory of Poppaea Sabina, we move on to other female figures who, unlike the empresses, built their power not in palace courts, but in the sacred space of religion, the Vestal Virgins, guardians of the eternal flame, whose purity and spiritual authority placed them at the center of Rome's religious and symbolic life. In a city where power was traditionally monopolized by men, the Vestal Virgins represented a monumental exception. Women invested with a sacred role, endowed with uncommon privileges, and revered as guarantors of Rome's very stability. Unlike the empresses who maneuvered through the hidden intrigues of the palace, the Vestals were public and symbolic figures whose authority transcended the domestic space and was fixed at the spiritual heart of the city, alongside the eternal flame that burned in the temple of Vesta in the Roman Forum. The institution of the Vestals traced back to Rome's mythical origins, attributed, according to tradition, to Numa Pompilius, the city's second king. The cult of Vesta, goddess of the hearth and fire, symbolized the continuity and protection of the community, and her priestesses were charged with maintaining the sacred flame constantly lit, under penalty of grave public calamity should it ever be extinguished. Chosen from the noblest patrician families, the Vestals entered the priesthood as children between 6 and 10 years old and remained for 30 years, a decade of learning, one of full service, and one of teaching the novices. The social status of the Vestals was unique. They lived in their own residence, the house of the Vestals next to the temple. They enjoyed rare legal privileges, such as the ability to manage their own property, and they participated in public ceremonies with unparalleled prominence and respect. They could even witness contracts and grant pardon to the condemned if such individuals crossed their path on the way to execution, a gesture that symbolized the absolute power of purity over the violence of the state. Yet the life of the Vestals was not only made of honors and prerogatives. Upon them weighed one of Roman society's most severe impositions, the absolute vow of chastity throughout their service. The purity of the Vestals was perceived as a reflection of Rome's own purity. Any transgression was seen not merely as a personal failing, but as a religious and political crime of the highest gravity. The punishment for a Vestal who broke her vow of chastity was terrifying, a trial conducted by the Pontifex Maximus, generally in secret, and if condemned, the priestess was led to the Porta Collina and buried alive underground, with a lamp, bread, and water, sealing her death in the cruelest of silences. This penalty extended beyond physical horror. It aimed to symbolically erase the existence of the unfaithful Vestal, purifying Rome of a crime that, in religious conception, threatened to rupture the pact between the gods and the city. Famous cases, such as that of Cornelia in the 1st century before Christ, accused of breaking her chastity and buried alive, illustrate the rigidity of this system, as well as the political use of such accusations, often motivated by familial disputes or personal vendettas, disguised as religious zeal. However, the Vestals should not be reduced to victims of an oppressive priesthood. Many of them achieved immense prestige and influence, intervening in political decisions and acting as mediators between aristocratic factions. The respect accorded to them, even by figures such as emperors and generals, demonstrates that their authority was deeply rooted in the Roman mindset. Elder Vestals who had completed their 30 years of service could marry and reintegrate into society, though many chose to remain within the cult, guarding the tradition and religious memory of the city. The symbolism of the Vestals as guardians of the eternal flame extended beyond the temple. They were the personification of the bond between Rome's past and future. So long as the flame burned, it was said, Rome would stand undefeated. Thus the priesthood of the Vestals was intrinsically linked to the city's destiny, and their presence in public rituals was a guarantee of divine protection and political legitimacy. Even military triumphs were accompanied by offerings to Vesta, as if victory on the battlefield were inconceivable without the silent intercession of her priestesses. With the advent of Christianity, as the empire's official religion in the 4th century, the cult of Vesta was progressively dismantled, culminating in the abolition of the Vestals by order of Emperor Theodosius I in 394 after Christ. The eternal flame was finally extinguished after nearly 1,000 years of uninterrupted vigil, bringing an end to one of the oldest and most powerful symbols of Roman identity. The ruins of the House of the Vestals, still visible today in the Roman Forum, remain a silent testimony to a priesthood that, more than any legion, sustained the soul of the city. Thus, as we leave the austere and sacred figure of the Vestals, we turn our gaze to the anonymous women of Rome, those who, far from the palaces and temples, faced the harsh conditions of daily life, building, through resilience and labor, the invisible foundations of the empire. They are the focus of our next journey, the women of the lower classes, who inhabited the alleys, markets, and workshops of the Eternal City. While empresses and priestesses left their names engraved in the memory and monuments of Rome, the vast majority of women who sustained the empire's daily life remained shrouded in anonymity, their lives erased from official historiography, yet fundamentally essential to the construction and maintenance of the most powerful city of antiquity. The women of the lower classes, whether free citizens, freedwomen, or enslaved, formed the base upon which imperial splendor was erected. It was they who, through tireless labor, silent resilience, and adaptability, kept the markets stocked, the homes clean, the clothes woven, the food prepared, and the children raised. In the narrow, unsanitary alleys of popular neighborhoods like the Subura, women lived and struggled for survival in a hostile environment marked by precariousness and violence. Most began working from a very young age, often alongside their mothers, in manual trades or informal commerce. Many worked as prostitutes, bakers, laundresses, weavers, midwives, and street vendors, composing a vital social fabric for the functioning of Rome, though systematically marginalized and despised by elite discourse. Freedwomen, former slaves who gained their freedom through manumission or accumulated savings, played a particularly interesting and complex role. Although legally below freeborn citizen women, many achieved relative prosperity, opening taverns, managing small workshops, or participating in trade guilds. Funerary epigraphy and preserved graffiti, especially in cities like Pompeii and Herculaneum, reveal stories of freedwomen who, through ingenuity and perseverance, ascended socially and claimed in the inscriptions on their tombstones a dignity that official history denied them. The world of enslaved women, however, was the most brutal. Women acquired in slave markets were used not only for domestic services, but also as instrumentum vocale, talking tools, subjected to sexual exploitation, arduous labor, and the absence of any legal protection. Yet many found ways to resist, whether by fleeing or by establishing effective ties and solidarity networks that, however minimally, softened daily oppression. Some managed to purchase their freedom or were manumitted by their owners, especially after years of loyal service or after bearing children who were often integrated into the dominant family. The sexuality of lower-class women was an object of surveillance and stigmatization by elites. Prostitutes were required to register formally, subjected to specific regulations and taxes, but also creating a parallel economy that energized much of the city's nightlife. Many of these women practiced their trade not by vocation, but as the only alternative to hunger and abandonment. Nevertheless, some managed to accumulate modest wealth, acquire property, or fund their children's education, defying social stigmas and shaping silent trajectories of resilience and self-overcoming. Motherhood among the lower classes was simultaneously a blessing and a burden. The absence of adequate medical resources made childbirth a constant risk, and infant mortality was exceedingly high. Women cared for multiple children, often alone, while striving to ensure family subsistence. At the same time, they developed mutual support networks, exchanging caregiving services, participating in communal religious festivities, and claiming, within the limits possible, an active presence in the public life of their neighborhood or village. The funerary inscriptions of these women are perhaps the most poignant testimony to their existence and resilience. Many left simple yet dignified epitaphs, declaring themselves as good mother, faithful wife, or honest worker. These are voices that, though muffled by centuries, echo through the marble, revealing pride in a life lived despite precariousness and invisibility. Beyond the domestic and labor spaces, lower-class women also participated in religious festivities and cults that allowed them moments of belonging and social expression. Female cults, such as that of Bona Dea, forbidden to men, constituted spaces where women, even the most humble, could engage in spiritual practices, share experiences, and strengthen solidarity ties. This diffuse yet essential presence of popular women reveals that far from being mere secondary characters or passive victims, they were discreet and irreplaceable protagonists of Roman life. Their capacity for adaptation, resistance, and agency ensured the continuity of the city and the empire, even if their names were not immortalized in triumphal arches or gold coins. And thus, after this immersion into the anonymous and resilient lives of the common women, we now move toward an even more ambiguous and fascinating space, the frontiers of the empire, where barbarian women simultaneously represented alterity, threat, and, paradoxically, the promise of renewal for Rome. They are the focus of our next journey, where the role of women transcends the walls of the eternal city and crosses the limits of the Roman world. Along the vast frontiers of the Roman Empire, where the limestone separated the civilizing order from what Rome called barbarism, women played roles that defied stereotypes and expectations, both of the Romans and of their own peoples. While the elites of the Eternal City gazed with contempt and fascination upon the Germanic, Celtic, Dacian or Parthian peoples, barbarian women emerged alternately as symbols of submission and exoticism, or as icons of indomitable resistance and warrior strength. These female figures, though sometimes romanticized or demonized by Roman chroniclers, exerted significant influence over the empire's destiny, whether through marital alliances, bloody revolts, or processes of acculturation that forever transformed the political and cultural landscape of the Roman world. For Rome, the body of the barbarian woman simultaneously represented an object of domination and an instrument of integration. Many were captured during military campaigns and turned into enslaved persons, scattered throughout the villas and cities of the empire, where they performed domestic or sexual functions. Others were given as prizes to soldiers or merchants, or married off through political arrangements to members of the Roman elite or local allies, as an attempt to pacify territories and consolidate imperial authority. Thus, the barbarian woman, reduced to a trophy, became an involuntary vehicle of Romanization, transmitting to her children the language, customs, and values of the Serbs. Yet it would be a mistake to limit the participation of barbarian women to the role of passive victims of Roman expansionism. Many were fierce leaders who took up arms against the invader, defending their communities with courage and strategy. The most famous of these figures is undoubtedly Boudica, queen of the British tribe of the Iceni, who in 60 after Christ, after suffering physical violence and humiliation at the hands of Roman officials, led one of the largest revolts in the history of Britain. Her army of tens of thousands besieged and set fire to important Roman cities such as Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, inflicting heavy losses before ultimately being defeated by the legions of Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus. The image of Boudica has transcended centuries as a symbol of the insurgent barbarian woman whose strength and determination defied the Roman military machine and inspired future generations as an icon of resistance against imperial oppression. But she was not alone. On the edges of Germania, women like Velida, a prophetess and spiritual leader of the Bructeri tribe, exerted decisive influence during the Batavian rebellion in the 1st century, providing guidance and religious legitimacy to the forces fighting against Rome. These women, in the eyes of the Romans, were simultaneously feared and admired. Chroniclers such as Tacitus marveled at the courage of Germanic women who accompanied their husbands on campaigns, incited them to combat, and often participated directly in battles. In his work, Germania, Tacitus describes how the women of these tribes were guardians of traditions and arbiters of conflicts, frequently revered as possessors of prophetic gifts and intermediaries between men and the gods. This perception, though often idealized, reveals the symbolic and practical impact of barbarian women on the social and political dynamics at the empire's frontiers. In diplomatic relations, marital alliances with barbarian women played an essential role in Rome's policy of stabilizing and Romanizing conquered territories. These unions, often forged between Roman governors and local princesses, aimed to secure tribal loyalty and promote cultural assimilation. By marrying a Roman, the barbarian woman introduced through her children Latin values and language, thus participating in the slow process of transforming peripheral societies into provinces increasingly integrated into the empire. Yet this process was not without tensions. Many of these women inserted into the Roman aristocracy faced prejudice and limitations, being viewed as exotic or inferior. Others, however, managed to transform their hybrid position into a source of power and prestige, influencing political and administrative decisions in their regions. Thus, the figure of the barbarian woman reveals itself as multifaceted, sometimes a warrior, sometimes a mother, sometimes a hostage, sometimes a cultural mediator. With the progressive crisis of the empire and the so-called barbarian invasions, the presence of women from Germanic, Hunnic, and Gothic tribes became even more visible, not as marginal figures, but as protagonists of a world in transition, heralding the fall of the Western Empire and the emergence of a new order. Many of these women accompanied the migrations of their peoples, participated in plundering, established mixed families, and contributed decisively to the formation of the new post-Roman societies that would arise in Europe. Thus, in contemplating barbarian women, we understand that the history of Rome cannot be narrated solely through the voices of its senators, emperors, or legionaries, but also through those of these women who, sometimes fighting, sometimes collaborating, sometimes suffering, sometimes triumphing, shaped the living and pulsating frontier that separated or united Rome and the world beyond its walls. And so, as we conclude our journey along the edges of the empire, we advance to the final stage of this long traversal, to reflect upon the legacy of Roman women, how they have been remembered, forgotten, or reinvented over the centuries, and what remains of their influence in the culture, politics, and memory of Western civilization. As we cross the centuries, walking from the heart of the Roman Forum to the distant edges of the barbarian provinces, we find, among ruins and scrolls, the indelible presence of the women who shaped, sustained, and challenged the Roman Empire. But as we arrive at the present, we are left with the question, how have these women been remembered, interpreted, and appropriated throughout history? The legacy of Roman women does not rest solely in sculpted marble or lapidary inscriptions, but also, and above all, in the memory shaped by historians, moralists, artists, and thinkers who, centuries after their deaths, continue to rewrite their destinies. For a long time, the traditional narrative about Rome privileged the deeds of emperors, generals, and senators, relegating women to peripheral roles, often caricatured as examples of virtue or corruption according to the morals and political interests of chroniclers. Livia Drusilla was celebrated as the perfect matron, but also accused of manipulating and assassinating Augustus's heirs. Messalina became synonymous with debauchery and excess, while Poppaea was reduced to a stereotype of dangerous and futile beauty. These images, crystallized in the works of Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dios, and Juvenal, were transmitted to the Western imagination as distorted mirrors, blending reality and fiction, and for centuries defining perceptions of female power and sexuality in antiquity. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the rise of medieval Christian culture, many of these female figures were reinterpreted through new values. Some, like Helena, mother of Constantine, were canonized and venerated as saints, embodying the ideal of the pious Christian mother and missionary whose pilgrimage to the Holy Land and discovery of the true cross secured her a prominent place in hagiography. Others, in contrast, were condemned as examples of sinners who had contributed to Rome's moral decay, reinforcing the Christian narrative of the empire as a corrupted body needing purification. During the Renaissance, the rediscovery of classical texts and the valorization of antiquity brought Roman female figures to light with new intensity. Artists like Botticelli, Mannerist painters, and Baroque sculptors represented Agrippina, Messalina, or the Vestal Virgins, with fascination and eroticism, sometimes celebrating their strength and beauty, sometimes reinforcing ancient moral clichés. Modern literature, especially from the 19th century onward, revalued many of these characters, exploring their psychological and historical complexity, as Robert Graves did in his famous work, I, Claudius, which reignited popular interest in the intrigues and passions of the imperial court. Archaeology, epigraphy, and feminist historiography of the 20th and 21st centuries played a fundamental role in deconstructing stereotypical images and recovering the agency of Roman women. Researchers began to question the veracity of classical accounts, often biased by misogyny and political agendas, and to illuminate previously neglected aspects of female life in ancient Rome. Analyses of female social networks, the economic role of matrons, women's participation in religious practices, and even in military and diplomatic structures open new horizons for understanding the Roman world. Today we understand that Roman women were neither passive figures nor mere adornments to male power, but full historical agents who knew how to exert influence, resist oppression, manipulate the rules, and at times subvert them. Their memory resonates in the words still carved into anonymous epitaphs: Matrona pia, mulier fortis, liberta industriosa. Simple titles, yet charged with a silent dignity that crosses centuries as testimony to their relevance. The legacy of Roman women also persists in contemporary popular culture. which continually returns to these figures to explore questions of gender, power, desire, and freedom. Series, historical novels, plays, and films reinterpret and update their stories, making them mirrors in which our own societies gaze, project their fears and fantasies, and sometimes recognize enduring continuities. Ultimately, the legacy of Roman women is not merely an object of scholarly study, but an invitation to reflect on the eternal dynamics of power, memory, and historical construction. In recalling Keis, Livia, Julia, Agrippina, Messalina, Poppaea, the Bapes Vestals, the popular and our barbarian women, we do not merely commemorate the past, we interrogate the present. Which women's stories remain silenced? Which memories still need to be rescued, reinterpreted, and celebrated? And so we conclude this long journey, aware that Rome was not built only by emperors, legions, and grand monuments, but also, and profoundly, by the women who, with their strength, intelligence, desire, and resilience, forever shaped the destiny of the eternal city, and with it, that of Western civilization itself. And so, as we conclude this long journey through the alleys, palaces, and frontiers of the Roman world, we are left to fall silent for a moment and listen to what, for millennia, has reverberated among broken marbles, faded frescoes, and the time-worn pages, the eternal voice of the women of Rome. A voice that, though so often stifled by the dust of history and the arrogance of chroniclers, who preferred to celebrate the bloody victories of generals or the rhetorical speeches of senators, never entirely ceased to vibrate, like an invisible thread that crosses the centuries, sustaining the living memory of the empire that shaped the West. In the silent colonnades of the Roman Forum, where the echo of assemblies has long dissipated, there persists like a subtle breeze the remembrance of the matrons who once walked there, of the Vestals who kept the sacred flame alive, of the mothers who molded future emperors, of the lovers who whispered counsel on nights heavy with intrigue and decisions that would alter the fate of millions. Every stone of the Colosseum, every triumphal arch, every forgotten inscription holds fragments of these existences, at times heroic, at times anonymous, at times sublime, at times tragic, that together compose the invisible and essential fabric of Roman society. This voice is not confined to the past. It continues to resonate in contemporary culture, in every narrative that seeks to revisit the past with a more attentive, more just, more complete gaze. It manifests in the hands of archaeologists who, with delicacy and rigor, unearth objects that belong to forgotten women, in the reflections of historians who rescue their biographies from the shadow of misogynistic sources, in the arts that reinterpret their images, offering them new meanings, and above all, in the collective imagination that increasingly recognizes that Rome was not built solely by the force of legions, but also by the ingenuity, sensitivity, and resilience of its women. And perhaps, as we contemplate the eternal city, we may perceive that despite the ruins and the inevitable erosion of time, Rome never truly fell. It endures, because the memory of the lives that composed it endures, of the dreams that nourished its days, and of the female hands that silently sustained its foundations. Eternal remain the figures of Livia, who architected the empire with elegance, of Julia, who dared to desire freedom, of Agrippina, who confronted tyranny, of Messalina, and of Poppaea, who challenged power on their own terms, of the Vestals, who guarded the sacred flame, and of all those anonymous women whose names we may never know, but whose existence made Rome what it was and what it still is, a profound mirror of human complexity. As we close this narrative, we understand that the history of the women of Rome is not merely a chapter of antiquity, but a perennial lesson about the ways in which power is constructed, concealed, and transformed, about how female resistance crosses centuries, always reborn like the fire of Vesta, even when we believe it has been extinguished. And thus, Rome continues, because its women continue, eternal, silent, but now, finally, remembered and celebrated.